Welcome back to another episode of the Catholic Buzz podcast. We're so happy that you're joining us again as we come together to talk about all sorts of things Catholic. My name is Father Daniele, and I am joined, as always, by Josh Sullivan over here and Matt Van Milligan on my right. Matt, how are you?
I'm good. How are you?
Yeah, good. Josh, okay?
Yeah, I was just about to take a drink before you introduced me, so I was like, wow, one of those.
You always have to be prepared here
I know.
on the Catholic Buzz.
Jumping, yeah, we're good.
Yeah, you always have to be prepared for the unexpected, right? And this is such a great segue, Matt. You're going to love it because I think many people found Pope Francis's motu proprio this past summer of 2021 unexpected.
Yeah.
Right? Yeah. And that's what we're going to talk about today. We're talking about the
Motu
Latin Mass, right?
Yeah.
We're talking about Pope Francis's motu proprio, which means a statement on this matter that he's talking about. And in particular for those, because we're going to try and take this episode a little slowly, because some people might say, why are they talking about the Latin Mass? Isn't that something from before Vatican II? So we're going to take it a little slowly here and explain, because a lot of people were sort of miffed that Pope Francis made sort of restrictions on the Latin Mass. And then just a few weeks ago in December of 2021, more sort of follow-ups to that motu proprio.
Clarifications, I think, right?
Yeah. And people are probably saying, what is he even talking about now?
The motu proprio.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, I thought you were going to explain it.
No, not at all. Yeah. I was just making fun of it.
Basically, what we're going to talk about today, in case people are saying, what the heck is that guy talking about, is we're talking about the liturgy. Yeah. So when you come to Mass, we celebrate in one way. You go to a Catholic church, where I'm the pastor, and you go to one down the street, and you go to one in the next town. You'll pretty much see a similar liturgy, right, with minor variances. But the church has prescribed a certain way to celebrate the liturgy, to celebrate the Eucharist. Now, this is the Mass that we celebrate today is commonly referred to as the ordinary form, which means it's the ordinary way where we celebrate Mass. Like I said, you go to anywhere in the world, for the most part, you're going to see the Mass like you celebrate at home.
When we were in Montreal, the whole Mass, we brought a bunch of boys to Montreal this summer, and we were all sitting there, and it was all done in French. Now, some of the boys might have understood French and stuff, but a lot did not. And so because we're there at Mass, we could still understand what was going on. We might not understand the readings and stuff, but we knew exactly when the time of consecration was. We knew exactly when the readings were, the psalm, all that kind of stuff. Like, the Mass is the Mass in any language. It's kind of a cool thing to kind of be able to attend any part of the world and have the same readings being said, the same, the Eucharist, Jesus is still being consecrated there.
Right. So that's the ordinary form. Then we have what's called the extraordinary form, which is what many people refer to as the Latin Mass, and not just celebrating Mass in Latin, not just celebrating like we would on Sunday, but in that Latin language. But we're talking about the Latin Mass, how it was celebrated prior to the liturgical changes of Vatican II in 1962. I hope I'm trying to be as clear as possible, right, as what we're talking about today. And then, even though Vatican II made some changes and said that the ordinary way for us to celebrate Mass is going to look more like what we're used to, there are still priests and communities in the world that celebrate regularly the extraordinary form, which is the Mass in Latin, the Mass prior to the changes of Vatican II. All of a sudden, and I shouldn't say all of a sudden, Matt, I know you're going to give us some history and context here, but in July, I believe, right? July of 2021, Pope Francis issued restrictions on the extraordinary form in a document that he released, and saying that it can only be celebrated at certain times for certain people. And anyways, that's what we're getting at. With the permission of the bishops. And the question we're trying to ask is, why? Why all the fuss here?
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah. Yeah. And I'm interested in it because, I'm inclined to kind of geek out about liturgy a little bit.
Sure.
And I think the distinction that you made is really important, that Latin isn't the issue. That it's that it's not as though just the language is the problem.
We could have an ordinary form in Latin.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
Just like we could have it in French or English or whatever.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah,
so that's not a problem.
Yeah. So the sort of surprising part of this is that it's the actual restrictions placed on the Latin Mass are a revocation of permissions that were granted 12, 13 years ago.
2007.
Yeah. So maybe the most Pope Benedict.
And so almost like a reversal.
Yes. Yeah. So that in itself is a bit surprising because we've talked in previous episodes about, well, like if the teaching of the church is, the same, that there's continuity there. There's that it seems kind of counterintuitive that, permissions were granted at this time and they're being revoked now. And, not to completely geek out about the history, but the context is important. So when Pope Benedict granted, universal faculties to any priest, and I believe 2008, in a document called Summorum Pontificum, he said, there is a kind of growing interest in the Latin Mass, and it is a beautiful expression of our liturgy, and it's in continuity, and it's participating in the history and tradition of the Church. Mm-hmm. So it's like in itself, it is a valid and true expression of our liturgy. There's growing interest, but there at the same time there was maybe a growing separation. Yeah. That some people who were strong advocates of the Latin Mass were also kind of against some of the changes that came about as a result of Vatican II. Oh. So the initial aim of Pope Benedict's allowance is that this is a way to bring everybody together. Gotcha. The goal here is unity. And in terms of objective, that's admirable. But in practice, in outcome, it didn't necessarily happen that way. And there have been kind of communities that have self-identified as Latin Mass communities, right, that have been kind of maybe growing in their disenfranchisement, their dissatisfaction with the current pope.
Exactly, because that already existed, right? Let's just say that people who regularly attend the extraordinary form of the Mass would have taken issue with Pope Francis on many other things too, and people who don't go to the extraordinary Mass. Really, in this age of social media and stuff, it's very easy to criticize the Pope and his decisions and what he says and what he doesn't say. Right.
That's right.
So this also was a group of people who are already sort of not happy with the pontiff, and now he comes and makes further restrictions on the Mass that they love to celebrate.
Yes, and I think maybe one of the mistakes that happens in discussions about this is treating fans or people who are proponents or really prefer the Latin Mass as kind of one homogeneous group.
That's right.
Yeah.
So and that's the real problem here. So you do have this kind of growing sectarian group of people who are moving more and more away from, you would say, kind of the ordained magisterial structure of the church, because they in some cases have real issue with some of the liturgies that have come out of the Vatican II documents, because Sacrosanctum Concilium doesn't actually give a liturgy. It gives kind of guidelines. For the direction of liturgy. And interestingly, even when Pope Paul VI kind of issued the new order of the Mass, or the ordinary of the Mass, following the Vatican II guidelines, those were published in Latin.
Right.
So it's not an issue with Latin itself, but with a lot of the things that were packaged with various interpretations of the Vatican II documents.
Okay, so just so that I can wrap my head around it. So the timeline that we have here, we had the Mass before, which was we would refer to as the Latin Mass now, let's say. Then we had Vatican II. Vatican II came in. We did an episode on Vatican II, or a couple. Two parts. And we talked about how they really wanted to bring faith back to the people, back to laity, back to that. And so they did a couple things, like they changed the language from Latin into English, or the form of the people where you're celebrating, which was the English and everything else, right? So that was the Vatican II
liturgical changes,
or one of the big stuff. Then from there, we move 30, 40, 50 years late, 40 years later,
60,
almost 60 years later. Okay. But when Pope Benedict said his allowed it to happen, there had already been 40 to 50 years ish of this change, because he saw that people there was a section of people that weren't quite celebrating or weren't quite happy with some of the changes that were made. Then a couple years later, they cracked down on exactly how we celebrate in 2011. I think people might remember. There's not a lot of changes that happened, but those that are involved.
When the New Roman Missal came out.
That's right. I see. The English translation, yes. They kind of cracked down exactly what the wording was.
A better translation to the original Latin.
That's right, yeah.
But in English.
Yes. And then from there, we moved to now. Pope just said, okay, I'm going to put some restrictions on we opened up the Latin door after Vatican II. We're opening up and again, I'm saying Latin Mass, but it's not Latin. It's the Mass previous to Vatican II, right?
The extraordinary form.
Extraordinary form. So we opened up the extraordinary form, and now we're going to not close the door, because he hasn't closed the door, but he's restricted the door to very specific things. Now, what you're saying makes sense, because if we're worried about a sect of people falling away from the teachings of the church, what he's done is allowed it only to be celebrated under the guidance of the bishop, correct? Under the permission of the bishop. And so if the bishop says, oh, yeah, you've got the right idea, you've got the right reasons to celebrate, then yes. But if it's you're going to become your own little sect, then the bishop can say, oh, no, I don't like this. This is not quite right.
Yeah, and I think that's a really important distinction, that the opening of the document actually goes to some length to identify itself in continuity with what Pope Benedict published, to say that the aim of Pope Benedict allowing this is unity, an attempt to bring traditional Catholics back into the fold. And in some cases, again, we can't treat proponents of the Latin Mass as one kind of monolithic group,
right?
No, of course.
But to say that in for those groups who were breaking away, that hasn't really improved. So it's not just a matter of, okay, no more Latin Mass. It's saying, no, if you're celebrating the Latin Mass, you have to do so in a way that falls into the magisterial structure of the church. So you need permission by your bishop.
Yes, I was going to say, so we're talking about restrictions. Some of the restrictions here is that it's the bishop's exclusive competency to authorize the use of the Mass celebrated prior to Vatican II, using the 1962 Roman Missal. So now, whereas Pope Benedict in 2007 gave priests sort of an open door policy, you can celebrate this Mass wherever and however you would like. Now Pope Francis is saying, no, the bishop has the competency to say who celebrates this Mass in his diocese.
Gotcha.
So you need the permission of your bishop to celebrate that Mass. That's number one. Then some of the other restrictions are that the bishop has to determine that those groups or parishes who are celebrating the Mass of the extraordinary form aren't doing so because they're denying
Vatican II,
the validity of Vatican II,
exactly.
The authority of Vatican II, right? So he has to sort of make sure that that community is celebrating Mass, but not sort of, ignoring or setting aside what Vatican II has said, right? It's also set out that priests who were ordained, so after the date of this issue of Pope Francis Motu Proprio, July 16th of 2021, anyone ordained after that date has to seek permission from the bishop, who has to seek it from the Vatican for this priest to celebrate Mass with the extraordinary form. Anyone ordained after that date, right? So those are some of the restrictions that Pope Francis mentioned in his Motu Proprio. My question is, and I'm gonna sound like sort of simpleton here, but why? Like why bother? You have a group of people who are celebrating Mass. It is a legitimate Mass. The Eucharist is consecrated. You have the faithful that are attending, and I'm picturing, the Latin Mass. I must say that I've only attended one Mass in the extraordinary form in my entire life. There are people who love the expression, the liturgy, and they're doing it out of a faithfulness of their heart, So my question is, why upset them? Why shake that cage, rattle that cage.
Intent. What is the intent to celebrate that Mass? If your intent was because, I think that would be what I would say that would sum up. If your intent was to celebrate that Mass because you love the style of Mass. Now, I've celebrated. I've been able to participate in a Mass that was being celebrated that way about 3 or 4 times now, and I do really like it. It's a cool reverence. It brings me back into the Mass after having, if I attended Mass all the time and everything else. Some parts of the Mass just stand out so much more to me when I went to that. It's kind of because there's a little tweak, a little change, and you go, oh, that's like, look at what they're doing right now. To me, it brought reverence to a certain part of the Mass that I might not have recognized before or whatever. But just having celebrated a little different. But what was the intent? For me, it was, this is the way that this, one was for a baptism, one was for an ordination. This is the way that this was being done, and it was a great experience for me to be there and be a part of it. But if the person was doing it specifically because they don't believe Vatican II is valid, then that's where you start to get this schism and this separation in the church. So I think what you were saying, that there's not just one. You can't just say one group, because there's a scale, I'm gonna say, of people that love it just for the Mass that it is, and that's what they attend. And then there's a group of people that don't believe in the validity of either our popes or the Vatican II or whatever, and that's a little bit.
Yeah, and for that first group, this restriction can be rather jarring, because we say, like, liturgy, if we want it, like, the sacraments matter. Yeah. Because the sacraments matter, liturgy matters.
Yeah.
So that, like, if liturgy isn't just a stage production, like we believe that liturgy actually affects an ontological reality in the Eucharist. So, like, to say that just the form doesn't matter or anything like that. So for the people who their intent is good, that they want to participate in the historical church, that they want to offer this kind of beautiful form of the Mass. In my experience, my interest in this started, 2007, 2008. That was when I was interested in becoming Catholic. Mm-hmm. And at the time, like, I was interested in, like, the Byzantine Church. I was learning this past week, I think, was the 10th anniversary of the Anglican Ordinariate. So that within the Roman Rite itself, and within kind of the universal church that we consider Catholic, there is a diversity of expression. So for the people who are just, this is a beautiful expression of the Mass, that was the only Latin Mass I've actually went to, was before I was Catholic. And to be honest, it was one of the draws to Catholicism, the reverence and the aesthetic, and so again, why cut that off? Intent matters. And that, but I actually have a friend who's a strong proponent of the Latin Mass, who actually thinks that these new restrictions may actually be a path back to having the Latin Mass and the ordinary form of the Mass being mutual expressions of the same rite. That this is a way of they're very frustrated with this contingent of traditional Catholics who are very kind of aggressive towards the current, but, like, this is the liturgical equivalent of, this is why we can't have nice things. That it's like you have these two groups going into Pope Benedict's decision that you have the kind of separatists, and you have the people who just are there for the beauty of
the Mass,
the liturgy.
Okay, so thanks for explaining that, because that's helped me to understand it a little more, right? So we're not doing it just to egg people on and say, hey, you need to be like us. Yeah, we're doing it. I guess it's there is a common goal here on unity, and there are maybe to address certain groups who are denying the validity of Vatican II. Yeah. That's hopeful. That I hope that in the future it will bring us together, right? Because honestly, for myself, it's like, hey, this Mass, what we now refer to as the extraordinary form. Remember. I've only been to it once in my life, but this is the Mass that was celebrated for 1,000 years, 1,000 years, or whatever it might be. I don't know the exact number of years. And then now, all of a sudden, in the last 60 years, to say that's not good. So that's given that's shed some light on the situation for me, which leads me to, as a priest, as a priest who celebrates the Eucharist, that's a big responsibility for me, and I take that seriously. The church has set out a way to celebrate the Eucharist, to celebrate liturgy in general, whether it's a baptism or a funeral or a Sunday Mass or Mass just in general, right? Now, it pains my heart when I see abuses, because in one way you see Pope Francis and other bishops who have reacted to the motu proprio, have clamped down on groups that celebrate the extraordinary form. And then you have churches all across the world who are doing wild and ludicrous things inside the Mass.
The clown masses, puppet masses.
But I mean, I don't know. I'd like to think I've traveled and been all around the place, and I've been to many churches in many different countries and all this stuff. And you, maybe your experiences too. You go to a Mass, you attend a Mass, and you say, What the heck's happening here? Is that not Jesus there in the Eucharist? There's no reverence shown to the Eucharist. Sometimes it's very showy. Sometimes the proper texts aren't used. And that's just sort of our common experience. There are the far out things, like you said, clown masses.
Yeah.
There's celebrations, liturgical dancing.
Yeah.
All these things. But why isn't there a motu proprio on these liturgical celebrations?
I think part of it is that there is a very specific way of doing things, and what happened, we kind of talked about it a little bit, but Vatican II came out, there was a change, and that change was very specific. And if you go into the documents and how the Mass is supposed to be celebrated, the wording in the Missal, and it's very clear. Even I think we talked about it during Vatican II. What's supposed to happen for music is very clearly laid out. What happens in music nowadays, what is actually practiced, is different. But part of that is, I think, that there is an underlying. People expected big changes from Vatican II, and some changes didn't happen the way people wanted to. And so people came back and started teaching the way they felt like Vatican II should have come out. Does that make sense? So they came back and they're like, oh, well, when it says this is what they mean. And so this is how we're going to either teach it in the seminaries to the new priests coming in. So the priests coming in are being taught by these professors that are priests that might have attended Vatican II Council and are getting this different idea, but then they go forth and then they teach that way. You know what I mean? And they teach their parishioners that way. And so I think you're getting like a mixed up, the Vatican II way. You get two different things. You have people that don't accept Vatican II, and they're on one side of the road, if you will. Like to some people are on the road, some people are off the road, and then you have people the other way, which are following the rules of Vatican II or the liturgy of Vatican II. And then some people decide to take their own road off to the right. And so they're the ones that, like, you do have clown mass or stuff. Or, like, we don't need to do any penitential, like we talked about the penitential rites and all that kind of stuff. We don't need to do that during the Mass because this is all about feeling good and feeling love. And, because that's maybe how they were taught, or maybe that's what they wanted to come out of Vatican II. If you read the rules, it's very laid out, black and white.
Yeah, and the parts that are optional are identified as optional. So
very clearly.
And you have these kind of far out examples from the 70s,
of course,
and examples now
from today.
Of people who are just not properly consecrated Eucharist and not actually taking. And there are gradations as well. Like, you have the absurd examples, but you have things kind of creeping in. It's like, well, rather than this Mass part, we're going to do this song or this kind of praise and worship song that is something kind of like the psalm. And like music, people who are doing music for Mass and people who are responsible for making these decisions have to keep that in mind. But it's interesting that when I was coming into the church, I had read Spirit of the Liturgy by Pope Benedict, where he kind of lays out like, this is what liturgy is, and this is like but I was in a community that was taking that seriously. So parts of the Mass, they used parts of the Mass were interchangeable with Latin, but it was the ordinary form of the Mass. So it was taking seriously all of the kind of values put forward, so that when I went to other churches, I encountered some of these kind of variations that I thought I was escaping, from my Protestant background. That it's like, okay, well,
why is this going on?
Yeah. It's like, is that a Coldplay song, or is that no? But it is interesting that you kind of identify both extremes. So you have this kind of sectarian divisive tendency in you would say traditional direction, but you also have this kind of sectarian divisive tendency
on both sides
in a progressive, whatever, however you want to label it, that it's almost a form of Protestantism. That it's a failure to recognize, the liturgy issued by the church in the form of, the missal, because we want to do something else. Or, it's kind of this interesting that these groups are becoming the consumer Christians, the consumer Catholics, pick your own kind of preference over and above what the church prescribes.
I think too, like I'm talking as a priest here, my liturgy training came from the seminary that I studied at, right? And I was blessed. I had some great professors, priests who taught me the liturgy, right? After you're ordained a priest, you come out of the seminary and you have all this liturgy training as a priest, and you're tossed into a parish that's not doing any of those things that you've learned. And it's frustrating. It's frustrating because you've learned, you didn't just learn how to do the liturgy, right? As in here's where you stand and here's what you say, but you learned why. And we pray through the liturgy. That's the most important thing is every liturgy is meant to be a prayer, not a show or not a performance, right? And I find it frustrating, those things that you learn and the reasons why, and your heart's there because you've prayed about it during class or during whatever. Yeah. And then as priests, you're ordained 5, 10, 20, 30, 40 years, is there any more liturgical training? Is there any more, I think we may have got liturgical, and I don't say we because I wasn't a priest at the time, but like when you mentioned the Roman Missal came out in 2011, there was some liturgical training. Was it done in a prayerful way? Was it done in an explaining way? I don't know. It was more like, I think, say this, here's the words that changed. But I think we have to remember what we're doing.
Yeah.
And I think that's why this liturgy is so close to everyone's heart, right? Because, you would say the more traditional Catholics who enjoy the extraordinary form, it's because they're realizing that this liturgy is a celebration of their faith, celebration of the Eucharist, and they want to take it seriously. They want to have it they want to elevate the worship.
That's right.
Right?
Yeah.
And then priests, Josh always says that he can tell priests who really love the Eucharist, right? by the way they celebrate Mass.
Yeah.
And it's true, and priests who do recognize Jesus in the Eucharist, priests who recognize what we're doing in the liturgy, we want to elevate that worship.
Yeah, for sure.
Right? And so to see liturgical abuses is heartbreaking. And I sympathize with people who like the extraordinary form, who have restrictions now on them because there's no restrictions being placed
on the
other side.
I agree.
On people who are abusing the liturgy that we have, the ordinary form, let's say.
Part of that would be, I would say that it falls to the bishops to restrict that, like to go in and say, because it's like, here's the recipe, and people are like, well, we used to do the recipe this way, and they're like, okay, well, we're going to open the door to this, and you're like, okay, we're going to close this door because you kind of took it too far that way. But people that are like, okay, don't have a recipe, and they're just making up a new one, it's up to the bishops to say and be like, no, this is the recipe. It's like if I took anything from the Bible in a year and it started over again, so if you don't have a chance, I'm going to encourage you again, do the Bible in a year this year. I love it. It started again with Father Mike Smits. One of the things that came over again and again and again when we're reading through the Old Testament, God showed the people how to worship. Like that was like the whole Old Testament. And then he took away things and then he gave them back, and he was teaching them, and he gave them laws and he gave them rules, and then he was trying to show them how to worship. And then finally he just gave up and came down to show us exactly how to do it. But that is the church, that's the church's role on earth, was to lead that worship, to lead that prayer. And so of course we have, God's given St. Peter and his disciples that authority to lead the worship. And so in doing so, we have to follow what the church says in this. That is God's that is the way God intended. You know what I mean? Like he tried through the prophets, he tried through his Israelites, and then it didn't quite work. He came down, he showed us what he meant, and then he gave it to the apostles and disciples so that they can interpret and guide us further to that worship ceremony. You know what I mean?
Yeah, and there's like this continual kind of reining in process, and you would say like you would hope that this is being done on the other side as well. Like even the name Traditionis Custodes like means the caretakers of
the custodians
of tradition.
Yeah.
So. Yeah. And there's kind of an ironic title that it's directed against those who would kind of self-identify as, the
custodians.
The custodians of tradition, against, the teaching of the church. But, even by issuing the missal itself, they're giving that like this is what's expected. This is that, maybe on the level of enforcement, Traditionis Custodes gives, a mechanism for enforcing maybe people who are going too far in one direction, that hopefully you would see kind of a corresponding document or at least corresponding enforcement from bishops to say, okay, you're tending too far in the other direction as well.
And it's hard. It's hard for bishops. Like you think, a bishop isn't in parishes every Sunday. He doesn't see regularly some liturgical abuses that are taking place. So it's hard. It's. I know the bishops are always the one to be criticized for it, but
it's coming out more now that we have COVID, we have taped masses, and we have it's kind of hard to hide from what's online, right? Like, and
that's true.
You have video evidence being like, no, see this part right here? This is not okay.
Not okay.
We had a previous episode where we really focused on the form matters. We talked about people whose baptisms weren't valid. So you do have those kinds of actions by the CDF
that
and
can be
by
taken.
the church to say that, okay, where we have evidence that people are not following the appropriate form, we need to rectify that.
We need the bishops with the stones to be able to put that discipline in place and put that action in place.
I think, one thing is that, we talked about after Vatican II, people tried to just sort of get with the times.
Yeah.
And I think we're realizing now, or at least some people are realizing now that's not working, nor should it work.
No, yeah.
Because what we do at Mass, what we do in the liturgy are things of God.
Yeah.
And they always should be higher or set apart from the things we do. Yeah. When we worship God, we're worshiping the Creator, we're worshiping our Heavenly Father, and those don't have to be like everything else. When you walk into a church and you celebrate the liturgy, the liturgy is where heaven and earth meet. And so it should be a taste of that. And by bringing in all sorts of things from today to make people feel more comfortable, we should be moving people towards the things of heaven instead, right? That's our goal as Christians. We're pilgrim people heading towards heaven. So, whether it's right or not, these restrictions that came down on the extraordinary form, whether restrictions are coming on other liturgical abuses, I think if people, priests, parishioners, liturgy committees, people of goodwill realize that what we do at Mass is to be pointed in towards the direction of God, to worship Him, then I think everyone can work together to make sure that we're following the prescribed text of the church, right, in order to worship Him. That's all the time. I know I sort of went on a rant there. I just want to point out, I don't know if you noticed, but here we are talking about tradition. Here we are talking about the Latin Mass and all these abuses. And Matt is wearing a Captain America t-shirt. I love it.
Yeah, it's a nice juxtaposition. I'm participating in history.
In history.
Yeah. This is an abuse of our podcast. Yeah, I'm just kidding. Okay, well, if you have any comments, which I'm sure you have on this topic that we've talked about, or anything we've missed, or anything that you want to add, you could send us a message at thecatholicbuzzpodcast@gmail.com, or comment right on our Facebook page or Instagram as well. You'll find us on both The Catholic Buzz there. And thanks for joining us today. We'll be with each other next week as we open up a new topic. My name is Father Daniele. And for Josh Sullivan and Matt Van Milligan, thank you for watching The Catholic Buzz.